Okay, this is going to be one of the sections in this issues and trends area where we are going to be focusing on teamwork, communication, and ultimately conflict management. Alright, so when you start thinking about teams, we've all been a part of a team at some point in our world, and I'm sure we have our own working definitions of what in the world makes up a team, but one of my favorite definitions of a team is a group that performs work that otherwise could not be accomplished easily, effectively, or efficiently by an individual alone. So when you think about that aspect of the definition of a team, that really truly does epitomize what we're trying to do within healthcare, because we all have in our healthcare teams a specific role that we need to accomplish in order for our patients to ultimately get what they need to get in the care of their illness or disease or surgery or whatever the heck it is that is bringing them into the hospital. So when you think about some of the teams that you've been on that have performed really well, kind of reflect back and see if you can't figure out what were some of the characteristics of those teams, and regardless of what type of team it was, can those same characteristics be applied to the work setting with a healthcare team? So some of the characteristics that we know make for good performance or good teamwork is when there's a leader that really truly sets the stage and sets the expectations, and not just setting the expectations, but actually starts building the members of the team up to where they can meet those expectations. So they really set the team for some growth and some development. The team leader ultimately seeks to build those characteristics within their team that lead to high performance, whether those characteristics existed initially or not. It's a very strong leader who can make that happen. In some of the ways in a business world, even to a certain extent within the sports world, but in the business world, there needs to be a very, very clear mission. What's this team working for? What are our goals? Are they very easily identifiable? And that mission and those goals should be known to every single member within the team. Other aspects that a good leader does when working with teams is truly clearly identifies the roles and the expectations of each member of the team, and constantly provide training to make sure that the team members have the resources and the skills needed to be able to perform at the level at which they are expected to perform. And I would say maybe one of the most important characteristics of a high-performing team is a team that really has very clear lines of communication. You have to have open and trustworthy communication. That communication has to go in all directions. It has to go from the members to the leader, but also within the members itself in a lateral aspect. And you won't have the ability to have that if there's not a certain amount of trust between each other. And just that, that environment of where you know that you are valued and that you are, if you weren't there, that you would be missed, and where you're feeling supported, and that the hard work you're going to do actually is worthwhile. It's needed. That's kind of some of those basic characteristics when you really think about high-performing teams. Some of the team building process that needs to happen is an overall process that's going to empower and sustain the work environment so that the team can perform at the level that they want. A couple of things that need to happen is there needs to be the coordination. It's the 3 C's. You need to have the coordination, the collaboration, and the consensus. That coordination is really getting the right people to work together. Ideally, within a team, you have the right people doing the right jobs. Without it, it's going to be very challenging. And as part of that coordination, you get that team to commit to the action. They want to have a thirst for learning or doing good work. Hopefully they've done the background work that's needed to be done in order to hit the ground running or to perform the way that the team needs to perform. It doesn't also help, or doesn't hurt, sorry, I shouldn't say doesn't help. It also helps or doesn't hurt is what I'm trying to say, if you actually have a love of laughter and working together, because most teams that are high performing actually have fun while doing their job. The next big step with that team building process is collaboration. Getting the right people to generate the ideas that are needed to solve the problems or make the decisions that are in front of them, and keeping that team moving towards the goal. It is sometimes easy for, especially when you have groupthink and team member action and working, to kind of veer off on the wrong path and to go down the wrong lane that's not really solving the problems that we need to be solving right now and there. It helps with this collaboration phase of the team building process to have buy-in. If you don't have buy-in of the team members, it's going to make instituting the change process almost impossible. I know I have talked in the past about sometimes a way to deal with one of your really strong, um, informal, negative leaders is to involve them in this change process. And this is exactly the reason why, within that collaboration phase of the team building process, establishing that buy-in is really important. The other thing in this collaboration phase, you really need to create a climate of safety or an environment of safety where the individual feels very comfortable putting themselves out there, essentially making themselves vulnerable by stating some ideas that may not otherwise be um, have been used before, or that might seem kind of strange or kind of weird, because oftentimes it's those very odd ideas that end up being the best ideas and actually the solution that we're looking for. With the consensus phase of this team building process, this is getting the right people to agree and commit to action. You can sometimes just wallow in a point within the team process of indecision, essentially, or a lot of discussion but no actions. It's probably one of my least favorite aspects of having to go to committee meetings and things along those lines, as you work so hard and you spin your wheels. I mean, you're going, you're committed, you're trying to make a process, and you think you're almost there. You're almost ready to make the change and get the whole group to commit, and it's almost like you have to step back and start all over again because they're really not able to commit to action. As soon as you get to action phase, everyone kind of panics and goes, well, what if it's not going to work? And then you start the whole process all over again. So a good leader within the team process is able to get those people to agree and actually commit to action that's needed. In this stage, having an eye for detail as well as a high level of patience is really effective from the team leader perspective. And this is just, what I have up here is one version of the phases of team development. I'm not sure if any of you guys have worked in teams before and noticed these phases from this aspect, but this was something that when I very first became a clinical director and was going to be in charge of teams, this is the process that the organization I was working for used to call it, with the forming, storming, norming, and performing stages. And this particular reference that I got this information from actually also has a fifth one called adjoining. But almost all teams go through some variation of these different phases. And in that forming stage, you can see in this graphic that I have where it's trust is unknown and the knowledge is hidden. That's that forming stage. The team begins, like they're just coming together, they're just forming, and they ultimately need to work through the issues related to the team's purpose, structure, and leadership, so that it's truly a totally an unknown aspect. Then you move down to the bottom left on this little graphic to the storming phase, and the storming phase is honestly a very confusing time frame. You can see where we've got on the outside of the square where there's a lot of distrust, and there's knowledge hoarding at this point. So in the forming, you don't really know who knows what. In the storming, you're not sharing what you know with anyone else because you're not really sure if you can trust the people to be okay with whatever knowledge it is and to not be threatened by your knowledge or anything along those lines. So it really is a fairly chaotic time period, and the team members raise lots of different questions about the leadership and what the structure is and what the purpose is. And if you don't have a good, strong leader, this point of the phase of the development of the team can truly just collapse the entire team, and the team may become totally dysfunctional. Then the next stage, as you're going counterclockwise around the square, is the norming phase. And you can see on the outside of our square, we now are starting to share the knowledge we have, and we're now beginning to collaborate. So in this norming phase, the team members are truly now agreeing on the matters of the purpose and the structure of the team, and they're prepared to perform the tasks that they've been assigned. So they're cooperative, they're mutually supportive, they're agreeing. This is a really good start to the work of the team. So it really starts to happen in this norming phase of team development. And then when you get to the performing, this is truly the ideal. This is that period of productivity. You can see knowledge is now not just being shared, but it's being created. We're forming new information, new solutions, new ideas based on the knowledge that we've shared with others prior. And it's really a synergistic point within the process. This is really where team members start to take pride at working together, and they're achieving their goals, and they're getting the job done. This is really exciting when you get to see that point of a team development in that true performing stage. And then the last step that's not on this square is the adjoining. And this is when you essentially, the team members disband. And the reason why this is not always a part of this process is that it's not always necessary. Sometimes a team stays together indefinitely and continues to monitor the process. But if you do have to disband the team for whatever reason, the project is done and they're not going to be the ones who are going to continue the monitoring of it, the quality assurance phase of it, then you do need to have the aspect where team members are going to leave, and you might actually have some mixed emotions about that, because you might not have really wanted to be a part of this team, but once you got to that performing stage, it was rather rewarding. And of course, like with anything, there's going to be challenges. Sometimes you can lose your footing because the problems that you think you're here to solve are way more complex than you originally anticipated, and or maybe you don't have the right people on the team that need to be. Sometimes you think you've got a good team formed and you've gone through the forming and storming stages and you're somewhere between the norming and performing stages, and you have to have team members who have to leave or step out of the process for one reason or another. And when that happens, it can be pretty disruptive to the team. If you have a good leader in place, it can actually be a little bit more seamless than you might think. And one of the biggest challenges I think that teams face is that there are certain situations where individuals on the team may have their own hidden agenda. They're not the team leader, but they have something that they want to accomplish throughout this process, and that they will undermine the work of the team. So that can be very detrimental, as well as just very frustrating if you're one of the team members. Okay, collaboration. I think we've all heard this term before, where we start working with each other and truly share ideas to get to a solution or a problem-solving aspect. It is helpful when you have face-to-face interchanges, although I will say with technology, it is no longer necessary to be face-to-face to have true collaboration. But when you do have that opportunity, it can really improve the team dynamic and the ability to problem solve. So when we think about collaborating, we are really working together. We're trying to coordinate and share vital information, and we're hopefully going to get to the outcome or the solution or the fix, whatever it is that we're working towards. In order to have effective collaboration, we really need to be, again, have effective and efficient communication, have a high level of performance and competence, have a strong amount of accountability. Collaboration will not work if you are too busy finger pointing, so without that accountability, it's not going to work. And you have to trust that you've got the administrative support that you need to get the job done. So you can see some of the critical attributes that we have of collaboration, and I don't think any of those aspects are going to be terribly unusual or unexpected for anybody. That in order for there to be collaboration, you have to be sharing, you have to make decisions, you want to solve problems, things along those lines. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about communication. I think we have all been involved in communication all of our life, and I know early on in the program you guys discussed communication ad nauseum, possibly. But it's the exchange of information or opinions. It's an interactive process. It's ultimately a means to an end. You're trying to communicate to achieve something, and it can definitely, without a doubt, be influenced by the context in which it occurs. We do know that the majority of communication is actually your nonverbal cues, not just your verbal cues, and that's a little bit different sometimes than what you would think about. So there's definitely things that can improve effective communication. That feedback loop is definitely important. It gives back information to allow us to know that the communication we thought we were sending has truly been sent and received by the individual. We want to make sure that it is appropriate. The replies by the nurse or the staff and the client must fit the circumstance and match the message. Have you guys ever seen that happen where the words are saying one thing but the nonverbals are saying something totally different? That's what we're meaning by appropriateness. You want those two things to match. Efficiency is something that many people struggle with in communication. We want to use the simplest, most clear words that we can, and as few words as we need to. Sometimes we go on and on about an issue and we really have absolutely no reason to do so, and it's not enhancing the value of the communication we're sending. Flexibility really means that we need to send the messages on and about the immediate situation rather than on preconceived expectations. And the challenge, or why this falls into flexibility, is you go into that communication event with a preconceived idea of what you think you're communicating about. And when you're in the midst of that communication, you have to be flexible enough to recognize when you had a preconceived idea that is incorrect and adjust and adapt your communication to meet the needs of the real situation and not the one you thought you were going to be in. And you cannot, without a doubt, have communication without having listening skills. It is probably one of the most important aspect of communication. It is maddening, although very normal for it to occur when you are communicating something to somebody and they are spending their entire time thinking about how they're going to respond to you and not listening to what you are saying. Very easy way to get off in your communication patterns by doing that. And astuteness is ultimately what I'm meaning by this one, is that communication skills can definitely be learned and definitely improved over time. And you need to, as a nurse, continue to work on that, regardless of what aspect you're talking about, whether it's with your patients or within the team that you're working on. And obviously, when we think about the flow of communication, there is a couple of different ways. It can be a downward flow, which is going from the top executives down to the lowest level of workers. So typically, this is your highest ranking administrator down to the people working bedside. Some examples of downward flow communication are things like the directives and the policies and the procedures or the regulations that the hospital is working with under. It could also be specific instructions that the administration gives out on employee expectations, or the employer's expectations of the employees is probably the more accurate way to say that. It can be your performance feedback when you're getting your yearly evaluation or something along those lines. And then obviously conversely to that would be upward flow communication, where this would be from the folks at the bedside to the upper level of administration, so your subordinates to team members. So this is going bottom up. This could actually be a little bit about communicating the attitudes and feelings of the actual employees, or suggestions for improvement or new ideas, because you're the one who is working at the bedside and have a good understanding of what needs to happen on that unit, and you communicate upward some of the changes you hope to see. And then horizontal is obviously peer-to-peer exchange. It's extremely important in the healthcare environment. We do this on a routine basis, don't we, as we're giving report from one nurse to the next nurse, or from one department to the other department. So that's the different flows. You can go up, you can go down, you can go side to side. Again, this should be old hat, you guys. This is just repetitive information from things you have learned elsewhere within your education. But the elements of the communication process, you have to have the sender, who is the person who's initiating the conversation. You have to have the receiver, the individual who's getting the message. Then you actually have the message. So, the sender's the who in this situation, who's sending it or who's initiating it. The receiver's the one who's taking it in, but the message is really what is being communicated. And then the encoding process is a part of this that you may not recognize or see that it's been done. But the sender is the one who's going to do this. It's really how we translate the message into the verbal or nonverbal symbols. So the encoding is really what words we choose to use and what body language we choose to use when we're the ones sending the message. And it's important to recognize that both aspects play into this, not just the words, but also the body language. So it's the verbal and the nonverbal. Then the next stage of that is the transmitting. So this is how the sender gets the information to the receiver. The sending or the transmitting can be in a numerous ways. Obviously, it can be a face-to-face interaction. It can be email. It can be text. It can be Twitter. It can be a gazillion different ways. And obviously, as we go to some of the more technical versions of transmission, then the nonverbals are not there. But it's amazing how many times people try to read tone into text or email messages, and truthfully, it's not there and can't be done. But we still try and do it. Then decoding is just the mechanism for translating the message into a form that the receiver can use. So it's just essentially the receiver taking the information that's been presented to them, and they try and make sense of that information. The behavior or the action is the behavior that's taken by the receiver as a result of the message that's been sent, received, and perceived. So communication can't be considered successful until the message received has been understood and acted on appropriately. So if the sender is sending messages but the receiver is doing nothing with them, there's no action, then the communication process falls down. And the feedback is when a new message generated by the receiver in response to the original message. So those are your different elements within your communication process. The sender is the who's sending it, the receiver is the who's getting it, the message is the what it is, encoding is the sender deciding how to go about communicating the message, transmitting is really the actual sending of the message, decoding happens by the receiver, the action happens by the receiver, and then the feedback happens by the receiver. Okay, so that's really what we're going to talk about from the team management perspective, and now we're going to go on to conflict management. And I've actually got two different parts of different conflict management slides that I've decided to put into one, so there might be an odd break at some point in time, but we'll deal with that if it comes up. But obviously a conflict is just a difference in perception or a difference in opinion. It could be the consequence of real or perceived differences. And the perceived differences are probably the most challenging because you may not have a clue how the information you have sent has been perceived by a different individual. Perceived struggle between two or more people is what we're talking about within this conflict. Disagreement about something of importance to each person. It's not necessarily bad, but I would say most individuals typically tend to be a conflict avoider, but it truly is a natural and inevitable thing that's going to happen anytime you have two or more people working together. Some barriers that actually create conflict are like we talked about earlier, those preconceived expectations, or as we've talked about last week, the prejudices that some individuals experience, or biases, or very cherished beliefs. For some, it's just that ultimate need to control all situations. And when you get to types, this is where sometimes you'll find different information depending on what resource you're looking at. But some of the types can be the content or value, and this involves beliefs and values of the individuals involved. Different beliefs and or different values that prevent resolution of the conflict might be things like each individual's goals and some of their own morals, philosophies, religions, things along those lines might lead to this content or value conflict. Procedural conflicts occurs when individuals have the same goal in mind, but they have totally different ideas about how they're going to reach those goals. So you both know that you got to go from point A to point B, but one person's going to go to the left to get there and the other person's going to go to the right to get there. Then substantive or data conflict are those conflicts that occur when there's a difference about what the goals are in a particular situation. So in procedural, you both have the same goals, but you're going to go about it different ways. In substantive or data conflict, you don't even have the same goals. And sometimes that's based off the fact that you guys both have different information or lack of information, misinformation, or just truly different views on the relevance of the expectations or the outcomes. And then relationship conflicts causes issues of self-esteem. So individuals do not feel that the others are dealing with them in a respectful way. And I have to say that honestly within healthcare, this is the most common type of conflict that I have occurred over the course of my career. And this can occur from nurse to tech, from nurse to physician or physician to nurse, from patient to healthcare team. But ultimately, you don't feel like you're being respected the way that you feel like you should be respected, and that leads to a relationship type of conflict. So with conflict resolution, and this is where I'm going to talk about a couple of different aspects, but there's a couple of ways you can resolve conflict, and I'll go into more detail on a different type of way of looking at conflict resolution a few slides down. But you can just avoid, and I would say this is one of those things that many of us do. We avoid conflict at all costs, which means we withdraw, fail to acknowledge it exists. I often call this just playing ostrich. You put your head in the sand and you just ignore that it's there. Then you will find some who are very accommodating. So the accommodation method of dealing with conflict is really when you abandon your own desires, your own needs, and you just submit to satisfying the needs of somebody else. Often it's at your own expense, but you're willing to lose out so that the other side can win. It's a different way of avoiding conflict. You're just choosing not to engage in it. Not only are you choosing to not engage in it, you will actually help the other person get their needs met. To me, this is more the martyr syndrome, and I fight this all the time with one of my children, is that she will absolutely not agree with whatever it is she is doing, but she just wants to make others happy, so she gives in and does it. Competition is another way. I'm not sure it's a very successful way, but another way to resolve conflict. And at this point, you're just trying to defeat the other person. You're pursuing your own goals at all cost, and you want to win. And not only do you want to win, you want to make the other side lose. Definitely some individuals have this as their natural tendency and they have to fight it, knowing that it is not a very successful way to work in a healthcare environment, but you will encounter this over the course of time. And then you can have the cooperation or compromise, and this is where you exchange equivalent values by agreeing to not get in each other's way. Some will try and say that this is a win-win, and I'll describe this a little bit later on another slide. It can be a win-win aspect, but you're both having to give up part of what you really want. And then ideally the best way is collaboration, and this is where you really focus to satisfy the needs of everyone at the table, and typically it comes along with a whole new solution that you might not have otherwise thought of. So these are some successful steps to managing conflict that you need to have happen. It's helpful if you can both have a common vision. You want to have a situation where the power is balanced between the folks. Between the individuals involved. You want to make the best use of all the resources you have. You need to engage in relational thinking, and that means how can the parties see themselves in relation to self, other, and the system. So that's really taking all perspectives into account is what we're meaning by that one. Again, we understand and know the importance of listening, and we understand and know the importance of negotiation to truly get to the point where we'll be able to manage or resolve some of these conflicts. Now this is where I've got another little section added onto this because I found that NCLEX was actually having a lot of questions resolving conflict management. My students had been asking me for more information. So this is just a continuation essentially. These are still some of the frameworks for conflict management. It's just worded a little bit differently, but the defensive approach produces a win-lose. So this is kind of like that competitive aspect. Sometimes I will say it might be the only way to solve a conflict, but typically this is not going to be the approach you should take. If you do have to take this, like if you're the leader and you're having to take this approach, you know that it's going to create a win-lose. But if you're needing to do this, you want to separate the two individuals who are having the conflict and assign them. Sometimes you know you can't win with these two folks if they're the ones having the conflict, so you separate them. You put them on different shifts or try and ensure that they are around each other as little as possible. If they're on the same shifts and you can't avoid that, then you schedule them on different days because you can't handle, and there's no solution to this type of conflict because it's so defensive and so competitive. Sometimes you can finesse it through just restructuring and trying getting them to have different focuses to where they're not both supposed to be working on the same goal. They have different jobs within the unit, because a lot of times when you're going to the aspect of doing that, it's that they're both very valued employees and you want to keep them both. But it's really truly not a good way to deal with conflict in any way, shape, or form, because somebody's winning and somebody's losing and you're not ever resolving the issue at hand. But I do think it's important for a leader of an organization to recognize that there are going to be situations that no matter what they do, they cannot resolve, and sometimes it's the only approach we have left to us. Then compromise. I will say, growing up, this is what I always heard I should be working for. We should be working for compromise because it is a way to get a win-win. But in order to get a compromise, you are still losing something that's probably important to you. So, just like it sounds, each side gives up a part of their demands, you meet them halfway, and you can do this because both sides of the conflict want to have harmony. So they're willing to give up some part. If both sides aren't willing to give up something of what they want, it then progresses down to being a defensive aspect. So compromise does get you a win-win, but both people had to give up some aspect of it. Then with the last type, the creative problem solving, this kind of mirrors the last type from the section prior with the, and the name's just totally escaping me at this point, kind of what we called it with that last one. Not negotiation, I cannot come up with it at all. Collaboration. collaboration or creative problem solving. Sorry, it was driving me nuts not being able to think of it. But this is producing a win-win without having to lose something. And this is honestly what we really want to strive for if we can, because both parties are going to feel like they've gained something and lost nothing. And the parties truly come together to work and find a solution that fully meets everyone's needs. It is not an easy thing to do, but it is definitely, if you can do this, it is what you want to encourage to happen. So you need to get the folks together, create an environment that is mutually respectful for each other, be empathetic, good listening skills, listen to both viewpoints, and then have them collaborate or work together with each other to come up with a whole new solution that will meet both needs. This is a more defined step-by-step aspect to how to manage conflict. First thing you need to do, and I put this in here because I see this to be helpful when you are trying to analyze or answer these questions that are on the NCLEX and the HESI about conflict management, because it'll always be you're the leader and you're having to manage. In one way, shape, or form, that's what these questions are going to come about. So your first step is that you need to understand who's having the conflict. See if you can truly analyze the cause of the conflict. And I have to caution you in that when you're reading these questions, this becomes more convoluted, because when you're reading questions in a black and white paper kind of world, you can't interpret it as easily as you could if the individuals were right there. In the real world, typically the conflict or the cause of the conflict is anything but what the two individuals are fighting over at that given moment in time. So from a testing world, it can be sometimes more challenging to truly get to that, but you need to try and read through the questions to see if you can find if they allude to that at all within the question itself. Then you need to consider the alternative strategies. Choose the strategy that's going to produce the best result. And again, we want to really get to that creative problem solving because it's truly the win-win, but sometimes you just default to the defensive or the compromise if you can't. And then ultimately implement the decision. It is way easier said than done when we're thinking about conflict management, but those are the steps we want you to kind of have in the back pocket to be able to approach conflict management. This is a just different pictorial that kind of is talking about the past two slides when we've been looking at conflict management. And this is actually based off of two researchers named Blake and Mouton and their 5 styles of handling interpersonal conflict. And much of what they say is that there's forcing, withdrawing, smoothing, sharing, and problem solving. Again, very similar steps to what we have built or worked on before. And they said there's 5 behaviors within these. You've got the competing, and you can see that in the top right, where the arrows are going head to head with each other. One person's concern is satisfied at the expense of the other individual's concerns. Okay? And when you look at the outside x-axis and y-axis, you can see going vertical or on your y-axis is the amount of assertiveness or attempting to satisfy your own concern. So at the very bottom, you're very unassertive. At the very top, you are very assertive. So competing, you can see, falls within that square at the assertiveness side. And then along the x-axis is the cooperativeness. So you can see again on the left, bottom left is uncooperative, and the bottom right is very cooperative. So this competing or going head to head is high in assertiveness and high in uncooperativeness. So you can see right here, we're probably not going to get anything done. And you can see in that bottom left, you've got avoiding. Both folks are going to the opposite directions, right? We're just going to play ostrich here. You're very unassertive and you're very uncooperative. No problem solving is going to happen there, right? You can see if you move into the middle, we have a compromising. It's kind of midland for the assertiveness and midland for the cooperativeness, and you can see parts of the arrows get left behind. So you get to the same goal, but you've lost something that's really important to you. You can see in the accommodating, which again, not a very good conflict management process if you can avoid it, but on the accommodating, you can see we're really high in cooperativeness, but we're fairly unassertive. So you can see somebody is really giving up what they want just to let the other person have what they want. And in the upper right hand, you can see the most ideal solution is the collaborating. It's highly assertive, but it's also highly cooperative, and you're creating a new solution altogether. I've always loved this slide, especially when you're talking about conflict management. You can see that you've got these folks playing tug of war on top of this little silo or this little island with the alligators and the sharks circling beneath them, and they're doing the tug of war to the point that they both break the rope and fall into the alligator and shark pit, and no one wins, right? We've talked about these different strategies already with the avoiding, the withholding, the smoothing over, the accommodating, the forcing, competing, compromising, confronting, collaborating, bargaining, negotiating, and problem solving. So hopefully we've talked about the ways of conflict management that you can kind of see which categories these would fall in. And obviously what we want to have happen is the collaborating, the bargaining, the negotiating, the problem solving. That's your ideal aspect. It's not the competitive or the confronting, but it's dealing with the solution, unlike the avoiders or the withholding withdrawings.